Big Shaq limped away from the gleaming glass doors of the dealership, his breath ragged and his pride shattered. Pain radiated from his ribs where the manager's steel-toed boots had struck him, but the physical agony was nothing compared to the humiliation. He glanced back one last time at the towering building, the harsh fluorescent lights illuminating the shiny cars within, mocking him. The dealership had promised luxury and opportunity, but for Shaq, it had delivered nothing but scorn and violence. His only crime? Wanting to buy a car. Shaq had saved every penny from his construction job to finally afford a modest vehicle that would make life easier for his ailing mother. The manager had sneered at his worn boots and second-hand clothes the moment Shaq stepped inside. Polite at first, Shaq had endured the subtle jabs and snide remarks, but when he insisted on seeing more affordable options, the situation had spiraled out of control. The manager's disdain escalated into outright hostility, and when Shaq accidentally wandered into a restricted area, all hell broke loose. The beating wasn't just an act of violence, it felt calculated, deliberate. As the blows rained down, the manager's expression twisted into something far more sinister than mere anger. There was an unsettling flicker in his eyes, as though some dark force bubbled beneath the surface. "Get out, and don't come back," the manager hissed, his voice dripping with venom. Now, as Shaq limped down the sidewalk, his head throbbed with a mixture of pain and confusion. Why had the manager reacted so violently? Sure, there was discrimination, but this felt deeper, darker, almost inhuman. Shaq clenched his fists, his mind racing. He couldn't let this go. When he arrived home, his mother was waiting with concern etched across her face. "Shaq, what happened?" she asked, rushing to his side. "It's nothing, Ma. Just a misunderstanding," Shaq lied, forcing a smile. He didn't want to worry her, not when her health was already fragile. But as the night wore on, Shaq found himself unable to sleep. His ribs ached, but it was the lingering sense of unease that kept him awake. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the flicker in the manager's gaze, the way the dealership's lights had dimmed at that exact moment, as if reacting to his presence. The whispers started around midnight. At first, they were faint, a distant murmur that seemed to come from nowhere. Shaq sat up in bed, his heart pounding, but the room was silent. He told himself it was just his imagination, a product of exhaustion and stress. But then the whispers grew louder. "Help us, trapped, save us." Shaq's breath hitched as he looked around the dark room. The voice was neither male nor female, its tone hauntingly neutral. He stumbled to the window, half expecting to see someone outside, but the street was empty. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice trembling. The whispers stopped, leaving an eerie silence in their wake. The next morning, Shaq chalked it up to a bad dream. He pushed the strange events aside and resolved to report the dealership to the authorities. However, when he called the local police, he was met with indifference. The officer on the other end barely listened before saying, "If you've got no witnesses, there's not much we can do." Frustrated but undeterred, Shaq began researching the dealership online. What he found sent a chill down his spine. Over the past decade, several customers had filed complaints against the manager, citing unprovoked aggression and strange behavior. A few had even gone missing after purchasing vehicles from the lot. That's when Shaq received the email. It was from a former dealership employee who claimed to have information about the truth behind the manager and his operation. The message was brief and cryptic, urging Shaq to meet him at a nearby diner that evening. The day dragged on as Shaq replayed the email in his mind, torn between curiosity and apprehension. By the time he arrived at the diner, the sun had set, and the neon sign buzzed faintly in the darkness. Shaq scanned the booths, his eyes landing on a nervous-looking man sitting in the corner. "Big Shaq?" the man asked, his voice low. Shaq nodded and slid into the booth. "You said you have information?" The man leaned in, his eyes darting around the room. "The manager, he's not what he seems. That dealership, it's cursed. The cars, they're not normal." "What are you talking about?" Shaq asked, his stomach tightening. The man hesitated, as if weighing whether to share the full truth. The manager is part of a cult. They use those cars to trap people's souls. It's been happening for years. Anyone who tries to expose them either disappears or, worse. Shaq stared at the man, unsure whether to believe him. Why are you telling me this? Because I tried to stop them once. The man whispered, his voice trembling. And now they're after me. But you've already been marked. They won't let you walk away. Before Shaq could ask more, the man abruptly stood and left, disappearing into the night. Shaq sat there, his mind racing. He didn't fully understand what was happening, but one thing was clear: the manager's violent reaction hadn't been random. As he walked home, Shaq felt the weight of unseen eyes watching him. The whispers returned, louder and more desperate. Save us! Shaq clenched his fists, his fear giving way to determination. Whatever was going on, he couldn't ignore it. The dealership had crossed the line, and it was time to fight back. Shaq spent the next day preparing himself, determined to uncover the truth about the dealership. The cryptic warning from the former employee replayed in his mind, fueling his resolve. He decided to return to the dealership under the cover of night, hoping to find evidence of the sinister claims. As the hours ticked by, the whispers grew louder and more frequent, almost guiding him toward his mission. With a flashlight in hand and a hood pulled over his head, Shaq arrived at the lot just after midnight. The dealership, with its sleek cars and pristine showroom, looked eerily still, as if holding its breath. The glass doors were locked, but a quick search around the perimeter revealed an unlocked side entrance. The moment Shaq stepped inside, the air seemed to change. It was colder, heavier, and charged with an unexplainable energy. His flashlight beam danced across the walls, illuminating framed certificates and glossy photos of satisfied customers. But something about the photos was off. The faces in the frames appeared faded, almost ghostly, as though the life had been drained from them. Shaq moved cautiously through the building, his footsteps echoing in the silence. He reached the service bay, where cars were lined up for repairs. One vehicle in particular caught his attention, a black sedan with deep scratches along its sides, as if it had been in a violent struggle. The license plate seemed familiar, and after a moment, Shaq realized why. It matched a car featured in a missing persons report he'd come across during his research. The whispers returned, louder and more urgent than ever. Free us, destroy it! Shaq's heart raced as he followed the sound to a dimly lit office at the back of the building. The door creaked open, revealing a space cluttered with old papers, strange symbols carved into the desk, and a book resting in the center. The book exuded a dark energy that made Shaq's skin crawl. Its cover was blackened and cracked, as if it had been through fire, and the pages were filled with cryptic writings and diagrams. As Shaq flipped through the pages, a horrifying pattern emerged. The dealership wasn't just selling cars, it was a front for a ritual. Each car was imbued with a curse, trapping the souls of unsuspecting buyers who met specific criteria: financial struggle, desperation, and isolation. The manager, acting as the cult's leader, used these souls to fuel some twisted purpose. Shaq's stomach churned as he realized the implications. The man he had met at the diner was right. This wasn't just about discrimination or greed. It was about something far darker, something that preyed on the vulnerable. The whispers intensified, pulling Shaq's attention to a hidden compartment in the desk. Inside, he found a set of keys and a small, ornate dagger. The keys appeared to belong to the black sedan, and the dagger's intricate design suggested it was more than just a weapon. It was a tool, likely tied to the rituals described in the book. Destroy the heart, free us, the whispers urged. Shaq didn't fully understand what he was up against, but he knew he couldn't leave without acting. Clutching the dagger and the keys, he made his way back to the service bay. The black sedan seemed to vibrate with an unnatural energy, its headlights flickering to life as he approached. As Shaq inserted the key into the ignition, the car roared to life, filling the room with a deafening sound. The lights flickered wildly, and the air grew thicker, almost suffocating. The whispers became screams, and Shaq could feel an unseen force trying to stop him. Drive, the voices commanded. With trembling hands, Shaq obeyed. The car tore through the dealership's glass doors and onto the empty street. The moment the vehicle hit the open road, the atmosphere shifted. The air outside seemed alive, swirling with a dark, malevolent energy that pushed against the car, trying to force it off course. Shaq gripped the wheel, his determination unwavering. He didn't know where he was going, but the voices guided him, pulling him toward a destination he couldn't yet see. As the car sped through the night, flashes of faces appeared in the rearview mirror, pale, desperate, and pleading. They were the trapped souls, bound to the cursed vehicles, urging him forward. The journey felt endless, but eventually, the car came to a sudden stop in front of an abandoned church on the outskirts of town. The building loomed in the darkness, its stained glass windows shattered and its doors hanging ajar. "Here!" the voices whispered, their tone almost reverent. Shaq stepped out of the car, clutching the dagger tightly. The whispers led him inside, where the air was thick with the scent of decay. At the center of the church was an altar, its surface covered in the same symbols he'd seen in the book. The voices grew louder, urging him to act. "Destroy the heart, end it." Shaq realized the altar was the source of the curse, the heart the whispers had mentioned. Raising the dagger, he hesitated for only a moment before driving the blade into the center of the symbols. The reaction was immediate and violent. The church shook, and a deafening roar filled the air. Shaq was thrown backward as a blinding light engulfed the room. When the light faded, the whispers were gone, replaced by an overwhelming silence. Exhausted and battered, Shaq stumbled outside. The car was gone, along with any trace of the malevolent energy that had surrounded him. Though he didn't fully understand what had happened, he felt a sense of closure. The curse was broken, and the souls were free. But as Shaq walked away, he couldn't shake the feeling that his battle with the cult was far from over. Shaq woke the next morning to a pounding headache and an inexplicable sense of unease. He replayed the events of the previous night in his mind, the whispers, the cursed car, and the explosion of light at the church. The dagger and the strange book he had taken were still in his possession, but they seemed lifeless now, devoid of the malevolent energy they once held. Despite his victory, he knew he had only scratched the surface of something much larger and far more dangerous. He spent the day researching the symbols he had seen on the altar and in the book. His internet searches led him down dark rabbit holes of occult practices, ancient rituals, and forbidden cults. One thread kept reappearing, a legend about a group of people who used objects to trap and manipulate souls for their gain. The more Shaq read, the more he realized how deep this conspiracy ran. The dealership wasn't an isolated case. It was part of a network spanning decades, possibly centuries, and the leader of this operation was someone far more powerful than the dealership manager. As the day wore on, Shaq began to notice strange things happening around him. His phone glitched whenever he tried to call someone, the lights in his apartment flickered inexplicably, and shadows seemed to shift unnaturally in his peripheral vision. It was as though he was being watched, or warned. The sense of unease that had started the day was now a full-blown paranoia, but Shaq refused to back down. By evening, he decided to confront the dealership manager again. This time, he wasn't going in blind. He packed the dagger, the book, and a small recording device to document any interactions. If he could expose the manager and the cult, he might be able to prevent further harm. As he approached the dealership, it was clear something was wrong. The lot was deserted, and the once vibrant showroom was dark and lifeless. The air carried an unnatural chill, the kind that settles deep in the bones. Stepping inside, Shaq immediately noticed the change. The space was no longer just a car dealership. It had transformed into something far more sinister. The walls were covered in strange, pulsating growths, as if the building itself were alive and feeding off some dark energy. The faint sound of chanting echoed through the space, leading Shaq to the main office. This time, he wasn't alone. The manager stood there, surrounded by hooded figures, their faces obscured but their intent clear. "You should have left well enough alone," the manager said, his voice colder and more menacing than before. "But you just couldn't resist, could you? Now you'll join the others." Before Shaq could respond, the hooded figures began to move toward him, their hands outstretched. The shadows around them seemed to ripple, as if they were extensions of the cult's will. Shaq backed away, gripping the dagger tightly. The whispers returned, louder and more urgent than ever, urging him to fight. Use it, disrupt the ritual. The manager raised his hand, and the air grew impossibly heavy. Shaq felt his chest tighten, as though an invisible force were squeezing the life out of him. Gasping for breath, he focused all his strength and lunged forward, the dagger aimed at the center of the strange symbols etched into the floor. The blade connected, and the effect was immediate. The room erupted in chaos as a blinding light burst from the symbols, sending the hooded figures flying backward. The manager let out an inhuman scream, his form twisting and contorting as if something inside him was trying to escape. The chanting stopped, replaced by a deafening silence that pressed against Shaq's eardrums. The shadows recoiled, retreating into the corners of the room as the oppressive energy dissipated. When the light faded, the manager was gone, and the hooded figures lay unconscious on the floor. Shaq stumbled out of the office, his body aching from the effort. The dealership was eerily quiet now, the pulsating growths on the walls reduced to ash. He knew this wasn't the end, but he had dealt a significant blow to the cult's operations. For now, at least, the threat had been neutralized. As Shaq exited the building, he was met by the first rays of dawn. The ordeal had taken everything out of him, but he felt a renewed sense of purpose. He wasn't just fighting for himself anymore. He was fighting for the countless souls that had been trapped and manipulated by the cult's dark rituals. With the dagger and the book in hand, he vowed to uncover the truth and bring an end to the organization, no matter the cost. The battle was far from over, but Shaq was ready to face whatever came next. Shaq returned home, his thoughts a chaotic swirl of relief, exhaustion, and determination. He knew he had struck a blow against the cult, but his gut told him this victory was temporary. The whispers, faint but insistent, reminded him that his actions had only scratched the surface. The cult's influence extended beyond a single dealership, and the manager was likely a small piece of a much larger puzzle. The dagger and the book sat on his kitchen table, their presence unsettling yet strangely comforting. Shaq pored over the book's cryptic symbols, cross-referencing with the notes he had scribbled earlier. It became clear that the rituals described were part of a network of ceremonies designed to control and harness human souls. The dealership had been a front for these operations, and similar locations were likely scattered across the city, perhaps even the country. The gravity of what he was up against settled on him like a weight, but he refused to falter. That night, as Shaq attempted to rest, his sleep was invaded by vivid nightmares. In them, he stood in a vast, shadowy expanse, surrounded by faces, lost souls that cried out to him in anguish. Their voices layered over each other, their pleas echoing in a haunting symphony. One figure stepped forward, translucent and hollow, its expression etched with sorrow. "They're coming for you," it whispered, its voice both a warning and a plea. "You have the key, but the key is also a curse. Use it wisely, or you will join us." Shaq jolted awake, drenched in sweat, the echoes of the dream still ringing in his ears. He couldn't shake the feeling that it was more than just a dream. It was a message, a warning from those who had already fallen victim to the cult's sinister practices. The next morning, he received an unexpected visitor. A woman in her late 30s, her demeanor sharp and purposeful, introduced herself as Detective Harris. She had questions about the events at the dealership. Shaq hesitated, unsure how much to reveal. "I know something strange is happening there," she said, her voice low and steady. "I've been following leads about missing persons tied to that place for months. You're the first person to walk away alive." Shaq studied her face, searching for signs of deceit but found none. He decided to trust her, sharing what he had seen, though omitting the supernatural elements for now. Her expression darkened as he recounted the manager's behavior and the hooded figures. "You've just described what I suspected, a human trafficking front with ties to something bigger. I didn't expect this," she said, gesturing to the dagger Shaq had casually left on the table. Her words confirmed his suspicions. The cult wasn't just targeting random people. Their victims were carefully chosen, their disappearances disguised as mundane crimes. Shaq decided to show her the book, explaining its significance in as much detail as he could muster. Detective Harris listened, her skepticism apparent but tempered by an undeniable curiosity. "I need your help," she finally said, her tone more urgent now. "If what you're saying is true, we're not just dealing with a criminal organization. This is something else entirely. And I think you're right, it's bigger than we can imagine." They agreed to work together, pooling their resources to uncover the full scope of the cult's operations. Harris provided Shaq with access to police databases, allowing him to cross-reference locations with patterns of disappearances and unusual activity. Together, they identified 3 more sites that matched the dealership's profile: an abandoned warehouse, a high-end nightclub, and an isolated private estate. The warehouse seemed like the most immediate threat. Harris and Shaq planned a reconnaissance mission, deciding to approach it cautiously. That evening, they parked a safe distance away and surveyed the building. The air around it felt wrong, heavy with an oppressive energy that seemed to repel them the closer they got. Shaq's hand instinctively went to the dagger, the whispers now louder, guiding him like a sixth sense. As they crept closer, they spotted faint lights emanating from within the building and heard muffled chanting. Shaq's pulse quickened. The scene was eerily similar to what he had witnessed at the dealership. Harris signaled for him to stay low as they approached a window. Inside, a group of hooded figures stood around an altar, their movements synchronized as they performed a ritual. At the center of the altar was a young man, bound and terrified, his muffled cries piercing through the rhythmic chanting. Shaq felt an overwhelming urge to act, but Harris grabbed his arm, stopping him. "We need a plan," she whispered, her voice firm but understanding. "Rushing in will get us both killed." He nodded, taking a deep breath to steady himself. They retreated to the car to regroup, formulating a strategy that would allow them to disrupt the ritual without being overpowered. Harris revealed she had called for backup, though she hadn't mentioned the supernatural elements to her colleagues. Shaq couldn't blame her, even he barely believed what he was experiencing. As they prepared to re-enter the warehouse, the whispers grew more intense, almost drowning out Harris's voice. Shaq clenched the dagger, its cool weight grounding him as the world around him seemed to blur. This wasn't just about saving the victim, it was about sending a message to the cult. They weren't untouchable, and their reign of terror was coming to an end. The whispers fell silent as Shaq made his decision. Shaq and Harris approached the warehouse again, their nerves taut with anticipation. As they neared the entrance, the oppressive air that had previously surrounded the building seemed to intensify. The whispers, once just faint murmurs in the back of Shaq's mind, now roared in his ears, growing louder with each step. He clenched the dagger tightly, its cold steel a stark contrast to the searing tension in the air. The power that had been dormant in the blade was stirring again, as if it recognized the magnitude of what was to come. They reached the warehouse's back door, its heavy metal frame slightly ajar. Shaq pushed it open with a quiet grunt, the creak of the hinges barely audible over the chanting coming from within. The cold, stale air inside sent a shiver down his spine, and he felt an unsettling pull toward the source of the ritual. Harris led the way, her movements calculated and deliberate, keeping low to avoid detection. They navigated the narrow hallways of the warehouse, the chanting growing louder with each passing moment. It was unmistakable now, the unmistakable sound of a dark ritual, one that was nearing its climax. Shaq felt his heart race, his thoughts swirling in a blur of urgency. The victim was in there. He had to act before it was too late. They arrived at the ritual chamber, hidden behind a steel door that was slightly ajar. Through the crack, Shaq saw the altar bathed in flickering candlelight, surrounded by cloaked figures. At the center of the altar lay the young man, bound and struggling. The cultists circled the altar, their movements synchronized, chanting words in an ancient tongue that made Shaq's skin crawl. The atmosphere was thick with dark energy, and the whispers grew deafening. Shaq's grip on the dagger tightened, and the whispering in his head grew more insistent. He could feel the power of the ritual, the souls of the trapped victims stirring. This wasn't just a fight to save one life. It was a battle against something far larger, something that had been feeding on the fear and despair of countless others. Harris tapped Shaq's shoulder, bringing him back to reality. She nodded toward the open window above the altar. There, 2 more cultists stood guard, their eyes scanning the room with unsettling intensity. They hadn't noticed Shaq and Harris yet, but it wouldn't be long before they did. Shaq nodded in return, his mind racing. He could rush in, but that would risk everything. If they didn't act carefully, the cultists could complete the ritual before they had a chance to intervene. They needed to disrupt the ceremony without drawing immediate attention. He whispered into Harris's ear, outlining a plan. They would split up. Harris would climb the ladder to the window above and take out the guards silently, while Shaq would use the dagger to sever the flow of energy in the ritual. The whispers now guided him, almost as if the blade had become an extension of his will, telling him where to strike, where to disrupt. They couldn't afford a single misstep. Harris nodded, her face steely with resolve. She slipped into position first, moving silently like a shadow, her eyes never leaving the cultists. Shaq's heart pounded as he crouched by the door, ready to make his move. Every instinct screamed at him to rush in, to save the victim, but he knew the ritual had to be stopped first. The dagger would be his guide, the only weapon capable of breaking the dark magic at work. He waited in silence, the minutes stretching into what felt like hours. Finally, Harris signaled from above. The guards were down. She was in position. Shaq moved, darting through the door just as the cultists began to chant louder, more urgently. The air thickened with an unnatural force, and Shaq could feel the weight of the ritual bearing down on him. He made his way to the center of the room, his movements swift and determined. As he approached the altar, the cultists' eyes snapped toward him, their faces twisted in rage. But it was too late. Shaq plunged the dagger into the ground beneath the altar, just as the whispers reached a deafening crescendo. The air pulsed with raw energy, the ground shaking beneath his feet as if the earth itself was responding to the disruption. The cultists screamed in fury, their chants turning into frantic shouts as the dagger's power began to tear through the ritual. The young man on the altar let out a final cry of relief before slumping unconscious, the binding energy dissipating. Shaq had done it. He had broken the ritual. But the victory came at a cost. The room trembled violently, and a dark figure emerged from the shadows. It was the manager, his form twisted and corrupted, his eyes burning with an unnatural fire. He was no longer just a man. He had become something more, something ancient and malevolent. "You think you can stop this?" The manager's voice echoed, impossibly deep and filled with fury. "You are nothing but a pawn in a game far older than you can comprehend." Shaq stood his ground, the dagger still clutched in his hand. "I'll stop it," he said, his voice steady despite the overwhelming force of the figure before him. "This ends tonight." The manager's laughter filled the room, cold and mocking. He raised his hands, summoning dark energy from the corners of the room. Shaq could feel it pressing in, suffocating him, but he refused to back down. The whispers urged him forward, telling him what he had to do. With a roar, Shaq charged at the manager, the dagger gleaming in the dim light. The battle for the soul of the city had begun, and Shaq was determined to finish it, no matter the cost. The battle was nothing like anything Shaq had ever faced. The air crackled with dark energy, a weight that pressed against his chest, suffocating him. The manager stood before him, an embodiment of evil, his form towering and unrecognizable, cloaked in shadows that seemed to devour the light. His eyes glowed with a sinister fire, and every movement seemed to warp reality itself. Shaq gripped the dagger tighter, feeling its cold edge pulse with power in his hand. He knew this was no ordinary fight. It was a battle for his very soul. The manager's laughter echoed in the room, a deep, reverberating sound that rattled Shaq's bones. "You think this dagger will save you?" The voice was a mixture of contempt and amusement. "You're a fool, just like the others. You're no hero." Shaq clenched his teeth, forcing himself to stay grounded. "I'm no fool," he said, his voice steady despite the growing pressure around him. "And this isn't just about me. This is about all the souls you've trapped, all the people you've used. It ends now." The manager sneered, his form flickering as though made of smoke. He raised one hand, summoning a wave of dark energy that rushed toward Shaq with terrifying speed. Shaq reacted instinctively, diving to the side, narrowly avoiding the blast. The force of it sent debris flying across the room, and the walls seemed to groan under the strain. Shaq's heart raced as he rolled to his feet, the whispers urging him forward, pushing him to act. He knew the manager wasn't just a man anymore. He was a vessel of something far older, a being that had existed for centuries, feeding on fear, despair, and the souls of the innocent. To defeat him, Shaq would need more than just the dagger. He needed to understand the source of the manager's power, the heart of the curse that bound him. As the manager advanced, Shaq's mind raced, trying to piece together what he had learned. The cult was only a part of a much larger, more insidious force. The cars, the dealership, the rituals, it was all connected, a mechanism designed to trap souls and feed an ancient entity that thrived on the suffering of others. The manager was the conduit, but not the true power. He was a puppet, a pawn in a game that Shaq had yet to fully understand. The manager lunged, and Shaq barely managed to dodge, the dark energy crackling past him. With every strike, the manager's power grew, the very air around them warping with the force of his attacks. Shaq's body was starting to feel the strain. His muscles burned, and his mind was clouded with the overwhelming pressure of the energy swirling around him. But then it hit him, the dagger. It wasn't just a weapon, it was the key. The whispers, the strange guidance he had been receiving, all pointed to one thing: the dagger was tied to the source of the cult's power. If he could sever that connection, if he could destroy the source, he could stop the manager. He could stop all of it. With renewed resolve, Shaq moved toward the manager, dodging another blast of dark energy. The manager snarled, furious at Shaq's defiance. "You can't win. You're nothing," he hissed, his voice dripping with malice. Shaq ignored the taunts, his focus narrowing. The dagger thrummed in his hand, a deep resonance filling his senses. He felt the pulse of energy beneath the manager's corrupted form, an unstable core of darkness that held everything together. It was faint, but it was there, an anchor, a point of vulnerability. Shaq surged forward, using every ounce of strength he had left. He swung the dagger, aiming for the heart of the dark energy. The manager recoiled, summoning a shield of black smoke to block the attack, but Shaq's resolve was unshakable. He pressed forward, his every movement guided by the whispers that had become an almost tangible presence in his mind. In a final, desperate move, Shaq thrust the dagger forward, piercing the shield and sinking the blade into the heart of the dark energy. The world seemed to freeze as the dagger's power clashed with the force that held the manager together. There was a moment of deafening silence, and then an explosion of light and sound. The manager's form writhed and contorted, his body twisting in agony as the dark energy began to unravel. His screams filled the room, a horrible, otherworldly sound that echoed through Shaq's bones. The ground shook violently, the walls cracking under the force of the energy being torn apart. The dagger glowed brighter, its power amplifying, until the entire room was bathed in blinding light. For a moment, Shaq thought he might be consumed by the explosion, but he held onto the dagger, refusing to let go. The whispers intensified, now screaming in a frenzy, urging him to finish what he had started. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the light faded, and the room fell into an eerie silence. Shaq blinked, his vision still blurry from the intensity of the explosion. When his sight cleared, he saw the manager lying on the floor, his body a twisted, charred husk. The dark energy that had once surrounded him was gone, dissipating into the air like smoke. The cult's grip on the room had loosened, and the oppressive weight that had suffocated Shaq now lifted, leaving him gasping for air. The young man who had been bound to the altar was free, his body no longer constrained by the dark magic. He stirred, groaning as he came to consciousness. Shaq approached him, offering a hand to help him up. The man looked at him with wide, grateful eyes, his expression a mixture of confusion and awe. You saved me," the man said hoarsely. Shaq nodded, still recovering from the battle. "You're free now. It's over." But even as Shaq spoke those words, a part of him knew the fight wasn't truly over. The cult had been stopped, but the darkness that had given rise to it still lingered. There were more souls to save, more battles to be fought. But for the first time since this nightmare began, Shaq felt a sense of peace. He had faced the darkness and emerged victorious. As he turned to leave the warehouse, the young man following behind him, Shaq knew that this was just the beginning. He had become something more than just a man. He had become a protector, a defender of the innocent, and a force to be reckoned with. And no matter what came next, he would be ready. The whispers, though faint now, still lingered in the back of his mind. But Shaq no longer feared them. He understood now. They were not just guiding him, they were part of him. And together, they would continue the fight. Shaq stood at the edge of the ruined dealership, the remnants of the building smoldering behind him. The night air was thick, heavy with the echoes of the battle that had unfolded within. The stillness around him felt unnatural, like the world was holding its breath, waiting for something. The whispers were quiet now, but their presence lingered in the back of his mind, a reminder of the power that had guided him. The manager was gone, the dark force that had taken root in the dealership destroyed. But Shaq knew this victory came at a cost. The young man he had saved walked beside him, still dazed and disoriented. His eyes flickered nervously between Shaq and the ruins of the dealership. "What happens now?" the man asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Is it really over?" Shaq didn't have an immediate answer. His mind was racing, processing everything that had just happened. The fight with the manager, the discovery of the cult, the ancient forces at play, it was all so much to comprehend. But in the depths of his being, he felt the shift, the transformation that had taken place within him. It wasn't just the dagger or the whispers that had made him strong. It was his will, his resolve to protect the innocent, to fight against the darkness no matter the cost. That was what had truly carried him through. Turning to the young man, Shaq gave a firm nod. "For now, yes," he said. "But there's more. This isn't the end. It's just the beginning." The young man looked at him, his face a mix of confusion and gratitude. "What do you mean?" "The manager is gone, the cult is broken. What's left?" Shaq exhaled slowly, the weight of the situation sinking in. "The cult was just a symptom of something bigger. An ancient force that feeds off fear, off souls. The manager was a pawn in its game. There are more like him, more places where this darkness has taken root. We've stopped this one, but we have to make sure it doesn't rise again." The young man's eyes widened as the truth began to sink in. "You mean there are more cults like this one? More people trapped like I was?" "Yes," Shaq replied. "And we can't just let it happen again." They stood there for a moment, the weight of the task ahead settling over them. It was a heavy burden, but Shaq was ready. He had always known that once he crossed into this world of darkness, there would be no going back. But now, he was more than just a man fighting for survival. He was a force of light, a defender of the innocent, someone who could stand against the darkness and break it apart. "How do we stop it?" the young man asked, his voice tinged with both fear and determination. Shaq's eyes narrowed. "We find the source. The heart of this evil. We take it down. All of it." It wasn't going to be easy. He had felt the power of the curse firsthand, the way it twisted reality, the way it manipulated the people who came into contact with it. But Shaq had learned something important during the fight: darkness could be fought, even if it was an ancient evil. With the right will, the right weapon, and the right allies, anything was possible. "I don't know if I can help you," the young man said, his voice shaky. "I don't know anything about this world. I'm just a normal guy." Shaq placed a hand on his shoulder, offering reassurance. "You've already helped more than you know. You've shown me that this fight isn't just about stopping the cult. It's about saving people. It's about protecting those who can't protect themselves. And that's something you can do, no matter where you come from." The young man nodded, his expression softening. "I don't know what I'm getting into, but I'm with you. Whatever it takes." Shaq smiled, a sense of pride swelling in his chest. We'll figure it out together. One step at a time. They turned and began walking away from the dealership, Shaq's mind focused on the next steps. The path ahead was unclear, but one thing was certain: he wasn't alone. They would face this together. As they walked through the quiet night, the weight of their mission ahead pressed on them. But Shaq couldn't shake the feeling that they were on the verge of something bigger, something greater than either of them could fully comprehend. The battle wasn't over, not by a long shot. But in that moment, with the young man beside him, Shaq felt something shift deep within him. This was his purpose now. He was no longer just a man trying to survive. He was a protector, a warrior, and he would stop at nothing to see this fight through to the end. "Let's go," Shaq said, his voice steady. "We've got work to do." The air was thick with anticipation as Shaq and the young man stood before the final hurdle, the heart of the darkness. The ancient force that had manipulated the cult, that had twisted lives and devoured souls, pulsed beneath them, its power radiating from an unknown source. Shaq could feel it now, stronger than ever, an overwhelming force that sought to corrupt everything it touched. His body hummed with the weight of the confrontation ahead, but his resolve was unshakable. They had come a long way since the dealership, following the cryptic clues and ancient texts that led them here. The path was winding, dangerous, and fraught with traps, but they had learned to fight together, drawing strength from each other and the knowledge they had gained. Shaq had trained the young man, teaching him how to harness the power of will and resilience in the face of unimaginable terror. He had come a long way, now standing tall beside Shaq, ready to face what lay ahead. "This is it," Shaq said, his voice calm but firm. "The source of the curse. The heart of everything we've been fighting against." The young man nodded, his eyes focused on the looming structure in front of them. It was a dark, ancient temple, its surface covered in symbols that seemed to shift and writhe as if alive. Shaq could sense the malevolent force emanating from within, a pulsating energy that seemed to call out to them, drawing them closer. "How do we stop it?" the young man asked, his voice steady but tinged with doubt. Shaq took a deep breath, the weight of the situation pressing heavily on him. "We destroy the heart. We sever the connection between the cult and the source of the curse. It's the only way to end this." "But how? We don't know what's inside. What if we're too late?" The young man's voice was tinged with fear now, the gravity of the situation finally sinking in. "We're not too late," Shaq replied, his voice resolute. "We've been through worse. We've faced death, and we've faced darkness. We've already won." The young man looked at Shaq, his eyes filled with determination. "I'm with you. Whatever it takes." Shaq nodded, a small smile crossing his face. "Then let's finish this." They approached the temple, the air growing colder with each step. Shaq felt the presence of the ancient force grow stronger, the whispers more insistent. It was almost as if the temple itself was alive, reacting to their presence, trying to push them away. But Shaq pressed on, his mind clear and focused. As they entered the temple, the atmosphere shifted. The air was thick with the stench of decay, and the walls seemed to close in around them. Strange symbols were etched into the stone, glowing faintly with an eerie light. Shaq's grip tightened on the dagger, the artifact that had guided him through this journey. He could feel its power, its connection to the light that could banish the darkness forever. It was the key, the only tool they had to destroy the heart of the curse. The deeper they ventured, the stronger the presence became. The whispers were now deafening, clawing at their minds, trying to break their will. Shaq's breath quickened, but he remained focused, determined. The young man beside him seemed to sense the growing pressure too, his steps faltering slightly. "Stay with me," Shaq said, his voice low but steady. "We can't let it get to us. This is just a test." They pushed forward, and at last they reached the heart of the temple. In the center of the chamber, a pulsating mass of dark energy throbbed in the air, swirling in a chaotic dance of shadows. Shaq's heart raced as he approached the source, the power in the room almost suffocating. It was everything the cult had worshipped, everything they had sacrificed for. It was pure malevolence. "This is it," the young man said, his voice filled with awe and terror. "We have to destroy it." Shaq nodded. He knew what had to be done. The dagger in his hand glowed with an intense light, its blade shimmering with the power of the light that had guided him through every step of this journey. He could feel the power of the curse pressing down on him, trying to break his resolve. But he held firm. He was not alone. Not anymore. He turned to the young man, who was watching him with a mixture of fear and admiration. "Stay back," Shaq said. "This is something I have to do alone." The young man hesitated but then nodded, stepping back as Shaq advanced on the pulsating mass. He could feel the energy of the curse swirling around him, trying to pull him in, trying to drown him in despair. But Shaq was stronger now. The will to protect, to fight for something greater than himself, surged within him. He wasn't just fighting for survival anymore. He was fighting for everyone, for the future, for the light to return. With a deep breath, Shaq plunged the dagger into the heart of the darkness. A shockwave of energy rippled through the temple, the force of it nearly knocking him off his feet. The whispers screamed in agony, the dark energy recoiling as the light from the dagger burned through it, unraveling the curse piece by piece. Shaq gritted his teeth, holding the dagger steady, pushing the light deeper into the heart of the darkness. The temple shook, the walls cracking as the darkness fought back with all its might. Shaq's body trembled under the strain, but he didn't let go. He couldn't. The young man was watching, his eyes wide with fear, but Shaq knew he had to do this. He was the only one who could. Finally, with a deafening roar, the dark energy began to unravel. The shadows dissipated, the whispers fading into nothingness. The power that had bound the curse for so long began to collapse, disintegrating into pure light. The temple, the heart of the darkness, shattered around them, crumbling into dust. Shaq stumbled back, breathless but alive. He had done it. They had done it. The darkness was gone, destroyed by the power of the light. The young man rushed to Shaq's side, his face filled with disbelief. "It's over. You did it. We did it." Shaq nodded, his gaze distant. "It's over. But this is just the beginning. We have to make sure this never happens again." Together, they walked out of the ruins of the temple, the dawn breaking in the distance. The world was still, the air fresh and clean, as if it had been cleansed of the darkness. They had won, but Shaq knew that the battle for the light was never truly over. There would always be more darkness to fight, more forces to stand against. But for now, they had succeeded. And that was enough.